The rain just keeps falling. It started the day my brother left, and now it just comes down and down and down. Mama keeps moving around the house like a rat in a trap. I can tell she wants to go out and look for Greg, but every time she goes out on the porch, she thinks better of it. Then she comes back inside and starts flitting around again. Then she might go out to the window and stare out into the rain, but only sometimes and never for very long. She sees something out there in the field, something she doesn't like. Normally, this would worry a person to death, but it beats the alternative. It's just the two of us now, Mama and I, and I'm almost loath to let her out of my sight. I barely stopped her from leaving the other night, and it was a very near thing. If I hadn't called her, she would have gone to the corn as well. I caught a glimpse of 2 scarecrows perched on the edge of the field, and you would have thought they were Dad and Tom as opposed to the ragged things wearing their clothes. That was 3 days ago. We've done little but watch the corn grow and the rain fall since then. The corn, that's still something I don't get. I can see from the front porch that the stalks of corn are waving, dancing in the pouring rain. The field stretched on forever, it seemed. A lush green and yellow sea that looked oh so inviting. I remember as a kid that I used to like to walk through the corn, running my fingers over the stalks and feeling utterly at peace as I drowned in that thick sea of green vegetation. But the corn can't be here. Mama and I picked it all last week. The field was empty before the rain started, save for a few stray stalks. That's how she saw Greg and I when we were fighting in the field. That's how she got to us so quickly. That field should be mud and old corn husks, not a rippling bounty of corn that it is now. It seemed to have sprouted overnight, and it hid my brother's activities from the eyes of those left in the house. That first night, I didn't really sleep well. I was tired, exhausted from the day's work, but the rain on the window was keeping me awake. It sounded like fingers drumming on the glass, and whenever I shut my eyes, I was treated to the image of thousands of fingers tapping on my window. They would come careening out of the inky blackness, thumping hard on the glass as they stretched from some monstrous hand. I lay awake, listening to the thumping rain as it hit again and again and again. The wind whistled against the house, creaking the boards and making them shift. I assumed the wind was pushing a tree against the window, as it did sometimes, but the thumping was irregular. It was not the usual scrape, scrape, scrape of the branches. It slapped woodenly against the window, threatening to break it as it tapped again and again. I finally sat up, unable to take that constant thumping, shining my flashlight into the dark room. Outside the window was a scarecrow, its bare wooden arms slapping at my window pane. I gasped, putting my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I'm not a brave boy. I'd never been a particularly courageous child, but I didn't want to wake my mother from what was likely a fitful sleep. The wind turned him in the beam of my flashlight, showing me a sack head with a jack-o'-lantern grin drawn in grease paint across his front. That wasn't one of ours. I had helped Daddy make those scarecrows, and this one wasn't one of the ones we'd made. He was dressed in blue overalls with a chambray shirt with a light and dark blue checkered pattern on it. His other hand was gloved, but the ungloved hand was knocking at my window. His black eyes seemed to stare at me, and I could feel malice behind them. There was hatred, but there was a promise in those eyes as well. As it stared at me, I could almost hear the words it spoke as the wind rattled them against the house. They were raspy, like my grandfather's voice before he had died a few years ago. I heard them on the wind, but I also seemed to hear them in my head. It was the voice of winter, the voice of harvest, the voice of the green. Coward boy, you are weak, but even you could make the soil strong. Come to the soil and make your suffering less. Give yourself to the green. It is the fate of your kind. Why fight the inevitable? I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the voice as I shuddered in my bed. That was when I heard the sound of my mother's door opening. Her footsteps were soft, hesitant as they came down the hall. walking slowly as though she were glancing around as she came. I could see her in my mind's eye, looking around fearfully as she walked down the hall towards the living room. She was leaving me. I contemplated just staying under the covers, letting her go, but the idea of being alone was too much to handle. I flew out of bed like an arrow and caught her just as she opened the door. "Mama, where are you going?" She looked back at me like she had been caught doing something wrong. She was half out the screen door, looking at the corn, the rain and the wind shaking the door as she held it in her trembling hand. She kept looking between me and the field, her eyes yearning, spellbound, but still not quite gone yet. I just needed to check on your brother. I know he's out there in the rain, and I wanted to bring him some clothes. It's been raining so hard, and I want him to... Come back inside, Mama. There's nothing out there for us. We just have to wait till the rain stops. Then we can get out of here and find someplace less wet." I don't know why I said it, but she laughed like a crazy person when I did. She let the screen door close noisily and kissed me on the forehead as she headed back to bed. I heard her door close, but I knew I wasn't going back to my own bed. I pulled the old comforter off the couch and slept under it as the rain beat down on our old farmhouse, harder than it ever had. As I drifted off, I remember thinking that the house would flood soon. Surely it couldn't rain so much and not simply sweep us and the corn away. Could it? My dreams that night were of our small wooden house rolling on the waves of corn, the house staying afloat as I desperately tried to steer it. There was a big wheel on the front porch, and I would turn the house to avoid the waves as they threatened to capsize us. In the water there was a large gray something, and it would ram against the house every now and again as we sailed against the sea. I turned to avoid it, but suddenly it leapt from the water, a huge gray whale intent on murder, and I heard the creak of a door just as I came awake. Mama was at the door again, and this time I had to physically lead her back to her room. I stuck a chair under the door this time and managed to sleep for the rest of the night. When I woke up, though, the rain was still falling. We spent today just sort of existing. Mama keeps going around the house, fitfully cleaning and straightening as the rain comes down outside. I didn't dare leave the house. Whatever was in the cornfield might decide to coax me out next, but I did peek out the window. The ground was very soggy, puddles and little rivulets beginning to form, but it wasn't as high as I would have expected it to be. It was hard to tell since the sky was so dark. The sun seemed trapped behind the dark clouds, as much a prisoner as we were. When someone knocked on the door, I jumped, thinking it might be a scarecrow. Or worse. Mama just stood there, looking at the door, and seemed afraid to answer it too. The knocker rapped his knuckles on the door a second time, and I found myself rising from the table. I didn't want to go, but I was the man of the house now, and such things were expected of me. I had taken a handful of hesitant steps when the knocker called out, asking if anyone was home. I blew a sigh of relief as I recognized Sheriff Dunland's voice. I walked a little faster, but when Mama grabbed my hand, I came up short. "Don't let him in. We don't need his help. We can figure this out. We can... But whatever it was we could do died on her lips. "We can't just leave him on the stoop," I said, pulling free and walking to the door to answer it. The sheriff was dressed in a duck-yellow rain slicker, his hat peeking out from under his hood, and for once he did not have a cigarette in his mouth. He looked pretty scared. "I'm glad to see you're safe. This rain's been coming down in buckets, and floods have started up everywhere. I figured I'd come and see if you needed rescuing, but it looks like the flooding isn't so bad out here." As he spoke, I could see his eyes straying to the field of corn that had seemingly sprung up like magic. "I just thought I might come out here to help, but the road's flooded, and as I was driving up, and I might be..." His eyes strayed more and more often to the rows of corn, and I could tell that the farm was preying on him. "Sheriff, would you like to come inside? You can get out of the rain, and..." "Rachel," he breathed, turning away from me. I caught his arm and tried to pull him back, praying he hadn't been lost as well. He half turned back, seeming to notice me again, and for a moment, I thought I might have gotten through to him. He took a step towards the house, then another, but as his foot came down on the threshold, he turned back to the corn. A voice that only he could hear was calling, and it seemed that its siren song was greater than my own. He pulled away from me and started towards the cornfield, shouting the name of his ex-wife, the one who had run away with a trucker years ago, if the town gossip was to be believed. I shouted for him as he plunged out into the muddy field, but it was too late. He was gone. The corn swallowed him as he ran into it, and I thought I saw Greg, grinning like a doorman welcoming in a guest, as the sheriff was lost to the green. I went back inside and told Mama that we were leaving. She seemed confused, standing like a doll as I slid the raincoat onto her. I pulled my own on and pulled on my rubber boots as well. If the sheriff had walked up here, then there must be a way to walk out again. We would just walk to town, away from the farm, and plan our next move once we were away from the whispering fields and the creaking scarecrows. Mama couldn't seem to manage her rubber boots, so I supposed her feet would just get wet. Better wet feet than the fate that awaited her out in the fields. We left, and I found myself nearly dragging Mama through the mud and water. Had it gotten deeper out here? It seemed like the water was higher than it had been only minutes ago. Mama kept looking back at the house, saying we should go back for Greg, that we couldn't just leave Greg alone. I ignored her jerking fits like a child who's not getting his way. If Greg wanted to come with us, he was more than welcome to stop playing in the field and come along. We walked down the muddy road until we came to the last thing I expected to find. The road had become a river. The sheriff's SUV was being pushed against a tree not too far from the gate, the water shoving it easily. The river was high and broad, easily covering the two-lane road and spilling past its barriers. It had flooded the farm next door to ours, but as it poured into our field, the ground seemed to drink it greedily. I stared at the river in a state of high dismay. We would find no escape here. Suddenly, Mama jerked free and ran back towards the house, calling for Greg. I turned to give chase, and there he was. He was dressed in the same dirty overalls I had seen him wear the day he ran out, his chest bare beneath and his hair slicked up like some wild thing. As she ran for him, shouting his name pitifully, I ran after her and tried to stop what I knew would come next. She had ran to within 10 feet of him, maybe less, when he darted back into the corn, and she made to follow. I was a foot behind her, nearly within grasping range, but my panicked, grasping fingers failed to connect, and her rain slicker slipped maddeningly out of my hands. When she made to cut through the corn, I finally lunged at her, tackling her onto the muddy ground. Then, in the mud, we fought. She shrieked Greg's name and lashed out at me, kicking and screaming like a wild animal. She was half crazed, her fingernails cutting my cheek, her knee attempting to find its way into my groin, and her shrill voice calling me every name she knew would hurt me. She wanted me to get out of her way. She wanted me to stop trying to keep her from Greg. She wanted Daddy and Thomas and Greg and anyone but me. I finally just wrapped my arms around her, burying my face against her stomach as I cried and begged her not to leave me. I knew that once she left, it would only be a matter of time before I left too, and was claimed by the field. She stopped as my tears wet her, and her anger seemed to disappear. I looked up to find my mother, seemingly back to normal. She hugged me, saying we should go inside and get out of the rain. I took her hand and followed her in, liking being led for a change. I would enjoy this lapse in sanity while I could. Who knew how long it would last? Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. This is part 5 of the Towesey Homestead saga. I hope you're enjoying it. I'm certainly enjoying reading it for you. Looks like it's time to thank our patrons again. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to be part of our Spooky Skeleton army over here on Patreon, come on down. For just $5 a month, you too can have your name read out at the end of every story. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening and a spooky week.